That's when we start. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here, whether you are here physically or online. This event is called Ethical Perspectives on COP27, looking forward towards COP28. My name is Valerian Bernard. I'm with the Brahma Kumaris, but I'm also part of the Geneva Interfaith Forum for Climate Change, Environment and Human Rights Group. I was part of the Interfaith Liaison Committee with the UNFCCC, and most of the organizers here are working with both groups, and we have been organizing events at the COP, one which you will be talking about later on by Budi. But for now, it is my pleasure to start this evaluation of COP27 from the ethical and human rights perspective with our friend and brother, Reverend Dr. Stephen Pitt, who will give a word of welcome in his home here to all of us.
Thank you. I'm Reverend Dr. Stephen Pitt, the Director for Theology, Mission and Justice with the Lutheran World Federation, where I work closely with my colleague, Elena Cedillo, who's part of the Action for Justice team focusing on climate justice. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this very important event. It's a great pleasure to be here because this is an event also organized by the Geneva Interfaith Forum, which we are an active member, and it's good to see different people here today. Now, I guess we are all ready just to plunge into the discussion, to delve into the ethical perspectives of COP27 and to look forward to COP28. Now, just to remind, especially for those who are coming for the first time, perhaps also online, COP27, also known as the United Nations Climate Change Conference, took place just recently. And it's a pivotal moment for the global community. There was a call to action for nations to work together to combat the impacts of climate change and to ensure a sustainable future for all. And all of your experts here, we've been through this before. So what does it really mean? It's not just about environment, isn't it? As faith-based actors, we talk about ethics. What is the moral responsibility as humans who wield so much power over the environment? And how do we think about it? And how do we strategize the way in which we act on this responsibility? So the issue of climate change is one that indeed affects us all, but for the most vulnerable, they bear the brunt of its impacts. And many of our communities on the ground experience this in their everyday lives. Droughts, floods, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and temperature changes, all of that, you know it, negatively impacts their livelihoods, health, food security, and access to water. So COP27 was the platform for the world to come together and discuss these crucial ethical issues. The conference was a place for governments, of course, and usually they get a lot of attention, NGOs and citizens to voice their concerns and call to action. But I think as faith-based organizations, faith actors, religious leaders, faith communities, we are acutely aware of how these challenges are so intense when we work closely with our communities who are suffering from these effects of climate change. In fact, churches, mosques, or those from different faith persuasions are often at the front line experiencing the losses and damages that are really caused by the changing climate. And it affects us all, whatever faith that you profess, or even no faith. But it's not just our duty as faith-based organizations to respond to these challenges. It is really a challenge, I would even say a calling for us. The spiritual and theological teachings of my own tradition, the Lutheran tradition, reminds us that fostering an ecological understanding of humanity and a call to care for all of creation is really important. And I think this echoes and resonates with many of you from all faith traditions. We must live in harmony with the environment, we say, rather than exploiting, misusing, or depleting it. Or in some cases, use of the word dominate, have dominion over, sadly, is abused in a way that hurts not only people, but the planet. So there's a call to action that cannot be ignored. And considering that we are still in unprecedented times, these pressing issues of climate emergency, loss of biodiversity, global energy crisis, food shortages, etc., require immediate attention and action, but also with your distinctive ethical and faith perspectives that could add to it. So now more than ever, I guess we are ready to act. Transformative actions that will significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase energy efficiency and renewable energy, and conserve and restore forests and lands. And that's where we need a lot of help and support from technical people and scientists who can guide us along and work together with us. Faith-based organizations have the potential to really make an impact in this regard. We can engage, and we have shown that we can engage in meaningful discussions on climate change, amplifying the voices of those most affected, especially the indigenous population, bringing new perspectives to the negotiating table. I believe in all these years, we have especially had the voices of the youth that were very significant in our advocacy efforts, and we have done that together. And we can also implement actions to raise awareness and ambition for our shared planet. So while COP27 decision marked a significant step forward in addressing these issues with a groundbreaking decision on loss and damage, it did not address the root causes of climate change or provide a clear path toward phasing out fossil fuels and reaching the 1.5 Celsius target. This is a reminder that there's plenty of work to be done. So this gathering, thank you for coming and spending this time together, is a chance for us to reflect on our involvement together in this process and to better prepare and strategize forward towards COP28. You know, these events bring so many high expectations, and sometimes when the expectations are so high, the disappointments are very high too, especially in relation to governments. So I understand there's a lot of frustration there, but I'm really confident that all of us here are committed to continue this journey. So I encourage each of you and every one of you to share your reflections and ideas, both in person as well as online. Really, all of your contributions are so important to bring about the change we want to see, whether it's through advocating for policies that reduce emissions, implementing sustainable practices in our own communities, or raising awareness for inspiring action. So let's work together to make it happen. So thank you so much. I wish you a productive and enlightening discussion. Look forward to hearing from you. Some of the thoughts first, for at least the first part. I'd like to apologize that I would have to leave a little bit earlier for another meeting, but I'll hear more from Elena and others of the outcome of your deliberations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for these words of welcome and for your input. It's really a pleasure to be all together from different faiths and different organizations working on these particular aspects together. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce now Vincent Paoliu. He has many hats. He was one of the negotiators also at the COP27. He's an independent expert for United Nations agencies, governments, and NGOs, and he's currently senior advisor with the Third World Network. He's also a visiting researcher, fellow at the UN Research Institute for Social Development, and a founding partner of the Clean Energy Innovation Partnership. So you were there. You were at the COP27 and you played a good role. So we would really like you to give us your takeaways on the COP27, the negotiation, and your perspectives about it.
Sure, thank you.
And Vincent has prepared a PowerPoint, so I think he will direct the PowerPoint from his seat.
And the reason I made this PowerPoint is because I thought it might be easier as well for all of us to understand sort of the interrelationships between the different elements that went on during COP. But on the first slide, which is in Latin, Hidaxidit like COP27, what happened in COP27. And I think before I go to this slide, I'm going to talk about where we are in terms of the climate change negotiations. And as you were saying, I've had the privilege of having been in these negotiations for the past 15 years, mostly from the quote unquote inside, in the sense that I have been a negotiator for developing countries in the climate negotiations year after year. I think at last count, I've been badged by 7 developing countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Arab group in different negotiations. So I've had the pleasure of speaking on their behalf and of trying to understand better where they're coming from as governments, I would say, not as but as governments, and trying to understand. And that has been in the context of the work that I have done at the South Center before, and now with the Third World Network. In the last 5 years, since 2019 in Madrid, I've had the privilege of coordinating the Group of 77 in China in the loss and damage negotiations. So I'll speak a bit more about that and how we were able to develop this idea of a loss and damage. Before I start off with where we ended up in COP27, let me just describe where we are in the overall regime development. And I think that I call that my Star Trek model of the climate negotiations, because it looks like the Starship Enterprise. If you are a sci-fi geek like me, it looks like the Starship Enterprise in terms of the model. I think that represents a key part of what I call the slow development of the multilateral climate regime over time. When the regime was developed in 1992 and it got adopted in 1992, if you look at sort of like how it's been developed from the first for the first roughly 10 years or so, there were 2 things that the governments were focusing on. One was that they focused on developing the mitigation part of that regime. So Kyoto Protocol, getting countries to look at what they were doing. And they were also developing what we call the transparency part of that regime, which was the system of reporting, what countries were doing in terms of their climate actions. So that was about the first 10 or so years. And then developing countries realized that that was not enough. Because when you talk about just emission reductions, then you are actually forgetting the fairness aspect of regime development. Because when you talk about emission reductions and the way that the narrative was being shaped during that first 10 years, much of the narrative was that, yes, developed countries have to do the most, but then developed countries during that period were slowly shifting the narrative into saying most of the carbon emissions are going to be coming from developing countries. And therefore, developing countries have to start doing more. Whereas developing countries were then saying, but most of the climate impacts are in our countries as developing countries, and therefore we need to look at adaptation more as a key part of the regime. And so that's why I think from the early 2000s to the, say, early 2010s, you had this second part of regime development where you had this more robust development of adaptation. So this is this discussion on creating an adaptation committee, creating an adaptation fund, and building adaptation into becoming part of the transparency reporting requirements as well. Then around the 2010s, if you then look, so you've got 3 elements now in the by the end of the 2000s. In the regime, you've got the element of mitigation, you've got the element of adaptation, you've got the element of reporting, but the element of what developing countries were saying as the means of implementation was not yet fully fledged. wasn't very much developed. The GEF was having difficulties in actually pushing enough money through the system to support developing countries in their climate action, despite the fact that in the UNFCCC and in the Kyoto Protocol, you did have provisions in there that explicitly said that developed countries have to provide financing to developing countries so that the developing countries can do climate action. So we saw over the 2010s this much greater focus on what we call the means of implementation part of the regime. So this led to the creation, for example, of the Green Climate Fund. This is now the current discussion about having this new collective quantified goal on climate finance. It stems from that focus that developing countries have in terms of saying, we need more support if you want us to be able to do more. At the same time as these parts of the regime were being developed, you still had the developed countries trying to scale up the mitigation side of it. And I'll explain why shortly. Why, or maybe in the second part of this conversation. Because largely when you talk about mitigation, you're talking about technology. You're talking about a more technocentric approach towards climate action as compared to a more community-based approach or society-based approach to climate action. Because technology works for developed countries. When you look at, for example, where many of the patents and who produces, for example, renewable energy technologies or environmental goods, more than 80% of those are either patented in developed countries or produced in developed countries. So if you have a climate regime that talks primarily about technology, then you're actually privileging the role of capital, the role of the private sector, and the role of those who control and own technology in that regime, which is what would happen if the regime was made into a very mitigation-centric regime. And that was not something developing countries were ready to do. And that was why you had all of these, over the past 20, 25 years, this really focus on building other parts of the regime, adaptation, the means of implementation, and other things. When the negotiations for the Paris Agreement started back in 2011, and the reason why it got started was because developed countries wanted to move away already from the regime that was built up over the previous 20 years, because they wanted to focus it more on mitigation. Developing countries were successful in keeping the more, I would say, the common but differentiated approach that was in the Climate Convention still in the Paris Agreement. And that's why it took a long time for us to finally agree on the Paris Agreement. And I was there during those negotiations as well, working with developing countries. And if you look at the design of the Paris Agreement, you do see a great deal of reflection in terms of the overall framing of the convention in the Paris Agreement. So you still had mitigation, you had adaptation, you had means of implementation, and a reporting regime in there. But what we realized is developing countries, beginning sometime in the early 2010s, by 2012, 2013, was that we were starting to go beyond. We were starting to go beyond not that slide yet. We were starting to go beyond what we could do as developing countries in terms of adaptation. And that is why in 2012, 2013, there was this big push coming from the G7 to start looking at loss and damage. Because if we are not doing enough as a global community on mitigation, because developed countries have not been pushing hard enough on that side, there's not much being done on adaptation because adaptation support is not forthcoming from developed countries. And the reporting regime are saying that things are not happening fast enough. And the means of implementation regime, the climate regime, clearly shows that technology transfer is not happening and finance flows are not happening. Then we have to create something within the multilateral climate regime to address the impacts of climate change, right? The loss and damage that we would experience. And that's why G77 came up in 2012 with this idea of having a mechanism it ended up being the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism with its institutional body. We thought it would be the solution. It wasn't, because it ended up being a talk shop. So in Madrid in 2019, we came up with the idea that we needed to have something on the ground, another kind of network that would actually trigger that kind of support to developing countries and the communities in those developing countries that would help address the impacts of climate change, that would address, whenever a super typhoon comes and hits Athena in my home country, for example, or the floods in Pakistan, or the hurricanes in the Caribbean, or the drought that's happening in Africa, you would have that kind of mechanism in there. So we tried to set up that network. And what we saw when we did the negotiations then on loss and damage in Madrid in 2019 was that the developed countries were ready to talk about loss and damage only from the perspective of humanitarian assistance, which wasn't sufficient, because we said, when you address loss and damage, it's not just about coming in for a few months, providing tents, providing emergency food. Yes, those are important, but it's also important to make sure that addressing loss and damage from climate impacts goes into creating better development opportunities, better employment opportunities post-disaster. And they were not ready to engage in that conversation. So we said, okay, have the network. We will work hard to make sure that this kind of assistance gets on the ground, but we need to have another funding stream specifically for loss and damage. And that's what we tried to do, beginning in Glasgow and then in Sharm el-Sheikh, creating the Loss and Damage Fund. So going to COP27, this is how it looks. You have a set of formal negotiations, and there are two sets of no negotiations, but still having outcomes. And so if we go to the next slide, so I'll go very quickly through this next set of slides in the next couple of minutes. So you have, for example, a cover decision. Just go up first, please. Then go down the next slide. So you have a cover decision, which provides sort of like broad ideas about what needs to be done. So explicit references to the fund, having transformation of the financial system, launching some kind of dialogues and new work programs. Then you have the result that we have on loss and damage, and I'll explain it a bit more. Then next slide, we have a result at Sharm el-Sheikh on what we call the mitigation work program. And this was being pushed hard by developed countries because they wanted developing countries to be more upfront in terms of the mitigation ambition. Then the next slide roughly talks about the financing and support for adaptation, where we, and this was coming from a big push by developing countries to try to talk about that. Then the next slide is about financing. And this was a big part of what happened in COP27, largely because developing countries were saying that developed countries did not fulfill their $100 billion pledge. What they're providing on the table is not sufficient. What is quite important, if you read the text of these decisions on finance, is that there is an explicit recognition that there is a huge gap in financing, somewhere in the order of about 3.5 trillion annually. And the amount of financing that developed countries are putting on the table only is somewhere around 35 billion. So, and that represents a significant step forward because developed countries never wanted to have that kind of numbers on the table. Then we have what we call the work program on agriculture and food security. I think this is another step forward because the way that this work program was shaped is that the developed countries wanted to focus on the mitigation potential of agriculture, and developing countries wanted it to focus on the adaptation impact of agriculture and how you build agroecology into those discussions. And how it shapes up is going to be something that's quite interesting. Then we have the next slide is on the next slide after that is on what we call the carbon trading mechanisms. And this is one of those big ticket issues that We fought significant tensions over since Paris, because this is one way in which developed countries felt that they could get a win-win in terms of not doing climate action but being seen to do it, because they would then fund developing countries to do it for them. So for them, this is a win. But I think personally, for me, for developing countries, is something that should not be the focus in terms of what they want to do. Then I think then we have the discussion about science there, which is about the means of implementation. Next slide. Which is about what needs to be done further. And then the next slide is about the impacts of response measures. And this is, I think, one of those issues that will emerge over the next 5 to 10 years, because this is where a discussion about, for example, geoengineering, about the use of unilateral carbon-based border adjustment measures will come in. And this is going to be one of those issues that we will see. So when we go to the next slide, which is about loss and damage, I think what really came out from COP27 was this historic conjuncture between what developing countries were asking for, a massive campaign and advocacy engagement by civil society and faith-based groups all over the world, and a clear articulation by the scientists coming from the IPCC Working Group 2 that we are hitting both hard and soft limits to adaptation, and that loss and damage will happen, is happening, and is going to happen even more in the future. So you had these three sort of like strands of science and campaigning and government, developing country government determination, exerting a lot of pressure on the developed countries with respect to loss and damage, which ended up with us having, next slide please, having this historic agreement in COP27 about establishing the Loss and Damage Fund and other loss and damage related funding arrangements. But again, it was historic because it was a recognition by developed countries that yes, that fund needed to be there, despite them saying no for forever. But there's still a lot of work to be done. All of those questions we still need to answer this year. We don't know how it will be governed. We do not know right now who will contribute to it. We do not know who will benefit from it. We do not know what that fund will pay for. We do not know what the quantum will be of that fund. We do not know how it will be accessed, and we do not know when it will start operating. So a lot of questions there on the Loss and Damage Fund. So let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What you're saying is so interesting that we were happy to listen.
Thank you.
The time is short.
Thank you for giving me the time.
No, it's really great to have you with us and to benefit from your knowledge. And thank you so much. I just wanted to remind everyone that there is a space for question and answer. So if you write them in the chat, then our friend Isis will actually monitor the questions. So do not hesitate. It is my pleasure now to invite a friend that is online. Her name is Reverend Neddy Astudillo. She's a Venezuelan, an eco-theologian, and a Presbyterian. She's based in the US, and she is at the coordination of the Spanish Climate Justice and Faith online certification program at the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary.
Okay, now I am. Now it says that I am. There you go. Yes, I am here. Well, good day, everybody. Thank you, Valerian. Thank you, Vicente. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to share from my own experience an evaluation of our involvement as faith-based organizations in the COP27 process. When I think about COP27, several things come to mind. As a description of this webinar read, a significant number of faith-based organizations mobilized to participate both in the negotiation process as well as in the raising the public awareness of the importance of this COP. And this is something that we did before, during, and after COP27. Before, we joined in webinars and public actions around the world, speaking publicly from our spiritual moral values. And we also did so inside of COP. But this time, I want to acknowledge the many limitations that we also had, and limitations that point out to the why we do and need to continue doing this work. Compared to other COPs in previous years, at least for me, COP27 took place in a world of contrasts and limitations. The beauty of its people alongside the cruelty of a militarized system, the contrast between rich and poor, the contrast between the beauty of the sea alongside the difficulty of its own people to enjoy that world, an androcentric dominant world that keeps women to limited spaces unless you're a tourist like myself, the infrastructure of COP itself, a huge venue, lacking enough water, food, and meeting spaces to support dialogue, an internet service that kept us disconnected from the communities that we were representing and seeking to inform about COP matters. The visa and price constraints challenged grassroots and religious organizations to have a greater presence at this COP. And in terms of sharing our voices, public actions within COP needed an official approval of the plan, of the words that we would say, and of course, no public actions could be done outside of COP itself. I mention all of this because the limitations that we experienced at COP to be prophetic, to live abundant life, to participate as members of society in decision-making processes, echo the reality of millions of people around the world who are impacted by climate change, but also had to deal with social and political constraints at the same time. So how do we move the climate justice agenda in an increasing hostile environment? Is one of the questions that came to mind. Where information and resources are controlled, we're limiting our voices and leadership. But even though with these limitations, we still showed up as witnesses of an international process, we share our faith, we lifted our voices of grassroots community leaders, youth, and some women. We met amongst ourselves as models of how to do this work in a multi-faith way, each faith sharing wisdom and learning from each other and teaching the world that it is possible to work together towards a common cause. And yes, we also did provide spiritual respite to negotiators and delegates that sought us in that way. I think that the question of how do we lift up the climate agenda in an increasing hostile environment while remaining prophetic not only will most likely be present at the next COP, but is also one of the challenges of which our organizations need to wrestle with. And as we seek to support faith communities, especially in the global South, and people of faith to join the climate justice work in a way that may also affect systemic change from within, in all our systems, in all the systems that we are related to as nonprofit organizations, religious institutions, and the government. Climate justice is racial justice. Climate justice is gender justice. Climate justice is welcoming the stranger. Climate justice is considering the lives of future generations. Increasingly, I believe that our presence at COPs needs to be also about lifting up the voices of women, Indigenous, Black, and Brown, and young people first than any other voice. They are at the forefront of the climate solutions and the climate crisis, and also need to be at the forefront of our own religious organizations. Transformation needs to happen from within. We have shown that we know how to do our interfaith work at COP very well, and I think we need to increasingly show how we do racial, gender, and generational work as well. This transformation is happening, and I believe also needs to happen with more speed and more sincere intention. Last, regarding the role of faith communities at COPs, I also want to make the point that while COPs recognize that climate change is a global crisis that demands global solutions, we contend with two challenges. One is that these global decisions take many years to be implemented and our time is limited. And second, that these decisions need political backing at the local level. So this means that we need to get involved as faith communities and support inclusive democratic processes. We can use the safety of COP to show how to do that, faith communities. The climate crisis is forcing us to put aside any proselytizing, any androcentric, colonizing, and anthropocentric agendas. It is time to be one with Earth and with the most people vulnerable. And for that reason, giving voice to the voiceless in our institutions alongside prayer campaigns. We need climate justice literacy campaigns. We need gender justice literacy campaigns, racial justice literacy campaigns. We need active solidarity with indigenous peoples, not just naming the stolen land in which we live in. And we need to do this, and not just a few weeks before COP, but all year long. Governments arrive at COP with many of the decisions already made, so most of the work happens at the local level prior to COP. As Bishop Julio Murray from the Anglican Diocese of Panama said during COP, what can churches do? Seek to find opportunities to work alongside governments and civil society in making sure that the responses that are coming to the most vulnerable people in our communities are responses coming out of justice according to the values of the kingdom of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing the ethical perspectives of the people who were there at the COP around climate justice and bringing Julio's voice also to the table. Thank you so much, Nady. One of the voices that was getting momentum this time is the youth voice. So it's our pleasure also to have Maro Mawa, who will be with us now. He's from Kenya. He's a high-level champion for climate action and a youth advocate for climate in Kenya. And we would really like to hear your point of view, your takeaways, evaluation of the participation of the young religious leaders and the perspective of the youth during the COP27. Please, the word is yours, Maro.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I stand to observe the protocol here presented, and I will take you through my observations and my evaluation as a youth. Number one, it's important to note that the presence and the participation of the youth in the COP27 was one that was noted with a high sense of spirit of unity. The youth came to Sharm el-Sheikh united just for one cause, and the cause was how we can reduce our global temperatures, how we can reach to 1.5 degrees. And that was evident even before we came there, because before we came there, we activated our local networks, our regional networks, and finally our global networks. And one thing that I give the Secretariat of the UN FCCC recognition for is the recognition of the youth. For the first time ever in the history of the COP, the youth were recognized and they were given a special place. That is the Youth and Children Pavilion. And this space enabled us to put our thoughts together and put the polluters on notice and the negotiators and the government representatives of our agenda. The spirit was so strong that has never been experienced ever before in the history of all COPs that have been happening. Number two, it's important to note the focus that the youth kept right from day one to the last day. Though there is a challenge that was associated with our youth participation, we never knew at what point we were crossing the boundaries. It was a heightened situation. We never wanted to be in the wrong foot of the Egyptian regime, but our focus was unwavering. We came armed with megaphones, with our creative nobles, with banners. We stood along the streets, in the hallways, all trying to advocate for justice, We really wanted to safeguard our future that is about to be stolen. And finally, number 3, we came there because we wanted to own our own space. We lobbied, and up to date and to the years to come, we shall lobby for our recognition, even in the negotiating table. We do not want to be proxies there, but we really wanted to be a part and parcel of the process. We may have experienced a few challenges here and there. Number 1, it was very, very difficult to lobby for our own interests. Now, the experts here can tell that last year's COP was one that was heavily dominated by lobbyists. There were around 600 fossil fuel lobbyists, a 25% increase than the previous years. And this made the agenda so difficult. At one point, we never knew if whether are we advocating for the funding of loss and damage while we are keeping quiet on how to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But our focus, as I have said, was unwavered. Another challenge that we experienced as our youth, apart from failure to get key negotiators into our own space, into the children and youth pavilion, we also had the challenge of not getting really to understand the negotiating terms and the processes. And this is a call to the parties that even before we come there is a need for the youth to be kept in the loop. There's a need for the youth to be told on how the process goes on, so that we may not just be there for the purpose for demonstrating and coming up with stands, but we may take fully into the processes and all the activities that are involved there. Personally, when I took the stage in the youth and pavilion square, I never forgot to remind the world that indeed the youth can take care of their own future. With the help of those who are here before, with the help of who I'm seeing right now in front of my screens, the youth can do something to protect our future and the future for those who are to come. I was never reluctant to communicate to the world that climate justice is intergenerational justice. Last, as I summarize, one thing that we left with uncertainty, though we are here, today we acknowledge and we are happy that the loss and damage fund has been created. We are uncertain of how the fund will get and trickle down to the youth and fund the youth-led climate action projects, something which is key. The youth are doing a lot. There is the development of the fund, the creation of the fund. But the question that begs here among the minds of many youths is how can this fund get to the youth and actually fund the youth-led climate initiatives? Last but not least, I want to applaud all the members that are here and also remind you that never walk alone, but please try to include the youth in all this process. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maro, for bringing this so important topic of intergenerational justice. This is one of the things that we really have been doing advocacy for. And it was wonderful to see the youth group move around at the COP27. It was one of the joys. Thank you. Last but not least at all is now our dear friend Alexandra Gosen-Ishii. She's with Soka Gakkai International, and she works as a program coordinator for Soka Gakkai International. And she's a community-based Buddhist organization. Soka Gakkai is a community-based organization, and her work focuses on the UN processes related to the environment, the climate change, and the biodiversity. So we would like you to tell us about the civil society participation at the COP, but also the human rights perspectives that was alive, very much alive at the COP27, including looking at the negotiations on action for climate empowerment, for instance, that you have been following. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me start maybe by thanking, Vice Nedi Maro, and especially Nedi Maro, I think you highlighted how key and crucial it is to have meaningful public participation. So I think this is something in terms of a movement within the COP that civil society across constituencies have really gathered together to fight for. Because although it's a legally recognized human rights, the right to public participation and to access to information, it's really still a big battle to have it exercised. And I think thanks to what was shared with you also some of the concrete challenges to it. And maybe so just to give like a little bit of context to this action, maybe this in Vice presentation, I think you saw from it's other matters in the little parts of other matters, action for climate empowerment. So of course it's a small part of the convention, but just to give some context, the beyond the fact that public participation, access to information are legally recognized human rights, they are also really prerequisite and key for effective implementation of climate action. And this has been recognized even by the IPCC itself in their special report on 1.5 degrees. So they've said that civil society is to a large extent the only reliable engine that can drive institutions to change at the pace required. So that has been really reiterated. And in terms of public participation, what does it mean to treat it as a human right? But it means that it has to be taken by governments as a way to correct imbalances of power, to have non-discriminatory practices, and to really uplift the voices of those who would not be heard and those who are most impacted. It also means that the states need to put in place measures that will create the enabling environment that will then make the structural change in the policymaking processes so that these voices can be part of the process meaningfully and can really meaningfully engage. And that's at the national level, international level. That also includes, in terms of participation, I think in relation to what Maro was saying, also in terms of the number of fossil fuel lobbyists who are present, it does include also protecting the democratic space from the vested interest in the process of, especially in that case, of corporate actors. So in terms of the ACE negotiations themselves, so the Action for Climate Empowerment, this COP27 was about the adoption of a new action plan, the first action plan for Action for Climate Empowerment. It was a long negotiations. The work program, the 10-year work program, was adopted in Glasgow. And what we saw in terms both of process and substance was that in Glasgow, it was very difficult for civil society for several reasons, of course, COVID as well, but it was very difficult for civil society to just even be present in the room during the discussion, which led in the end to an unbalanced work program where human rights are not even mentioned. And after that, civil society really worked ahead of COP, indeed, really speaking with delegations, but also at COP came together, and not only civil society, but from my perspective, as I was part of that group. And we really spoke for the process itself of these ACE negotiations to be open, which led to a fuss being made at the beginning of COP27 because they were about to close again, but they decided to open everything. So everything in the end was open, including the informal session, which are usually not open, or can be not open. And so that led in the end to actually a lot of constructive exchange of views between civil society negotiators, and that led to having in the text of the action plan itself the mentioning of human rights in one of the deliverable of the action plan, which is for the Secretariat to prepare an annual, it's smaller, it's for the Secretariat to basically prepare an annual report compiling what's being done on ACE at the national level, including human rights. And there is the quote of the Paris Agreement. So it does quote indigenous peoples, women, youth, and that paragraph itself. It was a battle, but I think then at least there is that in that action plan. And maybe, so that's important because it leads to, it's an element for accountability because with the action plan, you have to report against it. Maybe also in a little bit of a broader perspective, there is the fact that if we relate to the Geneva processes of the treaty bodies, more and more they look at the Paris Agreement, the policies, and make recommendations. Thank you. And so it also becomes something against which state, step by step can be assessed. And maybe one thing I wanted to share, for sharing two more things about maybe public participation now outside of ACE, but in the COP, about just this thing to the accountability, which we might find more in the human rights processes, I would say here in Geneva with the Human Rights Council, the treaty bodies, are one of our very good partners, the Center for International Environment and Law, CIEL, with whom we were working also actively on ACE. They've done research in the last 10 years about the treaty bodies' recommendations to states and how much it has mentioned the need for states to enhance public participation. So what they found is that in 2012, only one recommendation mentioned the need for states to enhance public participation. And in 2022, last year, already 22 recommendations were encouraging states to put in place better measures to enhance a real meaningful public participation. So I think it's a lens that and a frame that is also growing. And now, yes, I'm going to conclude. So maybe I'm going to conclude with two things. One thing that Vice also mentioned, it's the one thing that was negotiated was the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, and the advisory body of that will include a representative of indigenous people as observers, but indigenous people's representatives from the women's constituency and from the youth. So that was hard fought as well and pushed for by civil society being in those rooms. So maybe the last thing I can share now, just to conclude on, it's more on going to the cover decision. One thing that we can at least welcome and be happy for is that the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment was mentioned in the cover decision. And that was also a push by civil society being present, observing in the negotiations, because it was removed at some point, in the last hours. And so it was a big push again, not only civil society, many states fighting for it, many UN offices fighting for it, but all together, bringing this common joint effort to ensure that it is now the time where it has to be there. So that's something from a human rights perspective we could welcome. So to conclude, participation is really important, both at process level, at substance level, at national level, at international level. There are things we can really salute, but there are also really a lot of work that needs to continue to be done, and we must not leave our vigilance about it.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. It was like we were almost there with you. It's very important to also underline this victory of having the right to a healthy environment being pushed back in. I know that we said we could maybe welcome questions where we don't have time to answer them, but if there are questions, Isis, maybe you could read them and they could somehow bring some light to the second panel so that people's effort to be involved is actually acknowledged and used?
Yes, so online we do have one question from a friend from Pakistan. He says, Shalom from Pakistan. Here we are, Syrian Church of Pakistan. Is my question to all in the panel. In the recent times, there was the worst flood in Pakistan due to climate change. So wonders how we do serve regarding the loss and damage for rehabilitation, and how we do talking as we are part of the WCC. To join there.
So would you like to give a bit of an answer, the panelists that were here now, to this important question that was asked? I know that you have to go, so please feel free to go when you have to.
Yeah. Of course, you can have your break too, Maybe your answer will be
I'm sorry, it's moving here and I could not hear the question.
Lisa, can you read it again?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we serve regarding the loss and damage fund for rehabilitation efforts? And how do we join as we are part of the World Council of Churches? I think
it's from Pakistan. Pakistan in context of facing the floods. So we are impacted.
I think
perhaps I can also ask a follow-up question because Vincent is here, which Vice is part of the negotiator. No?
Yeah.
My understanding that it's not yet concluded, the loss and damage fund, but I think there is now more and more expectations coming from the grassroots on how they, who are at the forefront, as mentioned by many of us, especially those who are in the faith communities, they are connected with bigger structure, bigger network. So there is a higher and higher expectation as they are now coming to the concrete reality. But my question that is a bit related to this is that what is your prediction on this loss and damage fund, knowing that as some of us say that we make decisions in decades. The reality is that the situation is getting worse in days. So there's a huge gap between this political process in decades before coming to something concrete. But even if it is concrete, it is not, as you said, the real green fund was not as expected. So that might create more and more frustrations at the grassroots level. And how do you address that sort of frustrations from a negotiator perspective?
Thank you so much, Buji, for rephrasing the question and adding to it. We have two people online, so if you people want to speak, you just put your hand up so that our moderator knows about it. But Vince, maybe you can start and then, no? Okay.
No, thank you for those questions. Predictions are always difficult because well, we had a deadline in Sharm el-Sheikh to agree on the design of the loss and damage fund and its modalities and how it's supposed to operate, with that decision to be taken at COP28 at the beginning of December this year. Honestly, I don't think, given the way things are going, that we might reach that point. I'm not very sure for several things. One is that the transitional committee, this body of people that's supposed to start negotiating that design of the loss and damage fund, for example, is supposed to have started working already. But of the 24 people that are supposed to be on that board, 12 have not yet been nominated by governments. So it's not yet operating. It's supposed to have 3 meetings, at least, over the course of this year. And knowing the way, and I was involved in the negotiations for the Green Climate Fund back in 2012, knowing the way that these things go, unless they are very conscientious, they most likely will spend the first meeting fighting over how to meet. and what the rules are. And then maybe the second meeting fighting over what the agenda will be, and then the third meeting fighting over why they agreed on the agenda that they would have agreed. So we might end up at COP28 not having a decision ready. But that's part of the reality of it. But another reality that we might have to factor in, which I don't have a clear picture yet at this point, is how strong will the public pressure be and the campaigning pressure be on this body to actually get something done. Because governments respond to that in the way that they responded last year to creating this fund. Now, if there's a huge amount of pressure that this fund must be ready with a decision and its design and its modalities ready for adoption in COP28, then who knows? Maybe they might decide that there will be more meetings instead of just 3. And all of those things. I'm privileged enough to be both inside and outside in a way. I'm not going to be in the transitional committee, but I will still be supporting the G77 and the loss and damage discussions. And so along that line, the idea is for us as developing country negotiators and for the transitional committee members to be working hand in hand so that we are able to keep on pushing the envelope. Because none of us as developing country, quote unquote, representatives want the discussions about this fund to go beyond this year. We want it to be operational already by next year. And a telling sign as to whether or not the developed countries are willing to do it is that of the 12 that are still missing from the transitional committee, 10 are from developed countries.
That shows the lack of will.
So I don't know whether it's lack of willingness or whether they're fighting over who those 10 will be between the US and the EU and Australia and all that. I really don't know, but that's where we are.
I also had a question for you. At some point, you mentioned one topic that I'm interested in always is the geoengineering and the false solutions. Yeah. And this is, as we have identified a long time ago, a very dangerous part of the negotiations even. So how do you think our community of faith-based people could actually act on that? Because I've seen that the language has changed, even the scientific language has changed. So it's more worrisome than it used to be.
Yeah, definitely it is quite worrisome. I'm engaged with some of our other colleagues, I think Alex too, as well, right? And Eve over there on the geoengineering work in the Human Rights Council. So in the UNFCCC, you have some aspects of geoengineering sort of like having entered already. So carbon dioxide removal is there because many developing countries and developed countries have referred to it already in their NDCs. But as a policy topic where we want to have a decision, it's not yet there. But what is happening is, and what is worrying is what is happening elsewhere. So in the Human Rights Council, for example, there is this paper that's being developed on the impact of, they call it new climate technologies, which is short for geoengineering or long for geoengineering. We have in the IPCC discussions about that, and we don't know what will show up in the IPCC synthesis report. We know that the proponents of geoengineering are trying to push in the UNGA to get a resolution out on it. And so we're starting to hear rumors about that, and we know that, and I know that meetings have been done. So my take is that the issue of geoengineering, especially solar radiation management, and the more on the carbon dioxide, and then on the carbon dioxide removal side, like ocean fertilization and all that, might increase in prominence over the next few years, especially as the impacts become clearer that and the trend becomes clear that mitigation simply is not going fast enough and adaptation simply is not taking place fast enough. And so, like I was saying earlier, when I was, when I started my presentation, we have this several sort of like narratives that are now competing in the climate policy space. One is a narrative of urgency, and that urgency being addressed by technological solutions, which is what the developed countries tend to prefer, and a narrative among many developing countries, but also many of our campaigning organizations about urgency, but having that urgency being addressed in an equitable and justice-based manner, which then takes you into two different directions. Like one is, if it's technological, as I was saying, it takes us in the direction of looking at the private sector and capital as the primary motive forces for addressing climate change. Whereas if we focus more on equity and justice, it takes us in another direction, which talks about then democracy, about community action, activism, and organization, and having more of a community-based approach to climate action.
Thank you so much. I think that we are going to finalize this first panel now. So please stay online. We will have the second panel starting at 11:25. I'm happy with the outcome of this panel. Thank you so much to Vice, to Alex, to Nelly, and to Mahmoud.
We will start with a video, actually. It will be a short video looking at the impacts of climate in the Solomon Islands.
Welcome to Lilisana Village, a community with a growing population of children and youth. Here, in the heart of the village, just in front of the Catholic Church, is the playground for the children. Having no knowledge of what their future holds, these children will one day be looking for the playground.
Thank you so much for that really powerful video showing a very concrete example of slow onset loss and damage and its impacts on small island states. I will introduce all our panelists in one go for this session. We will have with us Cindy Kobe, who is a Kenyan advocate for climate justice and Indigenous people's rights. She founded and coordinates the OGIEC Youth Council, which is aimed at strengthening Indigenous youth engagement. She was at COP27 as part of the WCC delegation. And then after Cindy, we will have Therese Arneson. Therese is a human rights officer at the UN Office High Commissioner for Human Rights, where she has been working on climate change and environmental issues since 2019. Then we will have Budi Jajono, who serves as the Asia Pacific Program Coordinator and Deputy Advocacy Director at Franciscans International. Following Budi, we will have Isidore, who works as an independent consultant and has been representing Earth Justice at the UN in Geneva since 1991, focusing on mechanisms and norms linking human rights and the environment. And then we will close again with Vice, who at this point, I guess, needs no introduction. So we will start with Cindy, who joins us online from Kenya. Cindy, I hope you're with us, and I hope at some point. Thank you. Great. Yes. We can see you and we can hear you, so that's wonderful. Cindy, could you share with us what are some of the expectations from Indigenous communities, and not least your Indigenous community, as we look forward towards COP28?
Thank you so much, Athena, and the entire and all the organizers for having me in this panel. And as Athena has introduced me, I am an Indigenous woman, and looking forward to COP28. It is unfortunate that after every COP, we're always discussing what's next. We're always discussing about the next COP instead of implementing the pledges for the previous COP. So COP28 will be held in Abu Dhabi, a land of fossil fuels, a land that they are producing a lot of oil. And in 2021, back in Glasgow, in COP26, sorry, there was no pact to face down coal power. There was no pact to face down the use of fossil fuels. And even though we will be in a land of a lot of fossil fuels, we are hoping that COP28 will be able to address how they will face down the use of fossil fuels and set new targets for limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Indigenous peoples and local communities live at the center of a global climate and biodiversity crisis, and there has been a lot of evidence to their solutions to climate mitigation and protecting nature, and this is seen with many communities leading the forefront of the climate crisis. And we have also seen that these communities, the major communities that are the major stakeholders leading in responding to the climate crisis are Indigenous women and Indigenous young girls. And they're also leading in transferring of this intergenerational knowledge transfer from the younger generation to the older generation. And in COP28, we are, as Indigenous peoples, we are hoping that the 1.7 billion that was pledged back in COP26 will actually trickle down to the community, because as at now, approximately 7% of these funds which were pledged has gone directly to Indigenous people and local communities, and we want to see more implementation of these pledges. And we also want to see more local indigenous leaders creating the table and co-designing this, the climate solutions that have been tabled. We don't want to see these climate solutions being made in the boardroom, but we want to see them locally driven, community driven, and also with working with local organizations. It is important to ensure that we have the local voices, we have the local people, we have the community organizations leading the climate solutions. And moving forward to COP28, a lot really needs to be done, because last year in COP27 we were calling it an implementation COP, but not much has been done apart from development of the loss and damage fund facility, and also this loss and damage fund does not have a clear framework on how these funds will be accessed, who will be channeling these funds. So then there is no mechanism which has been developed, and we're hoping that in COP28 this will be developed. And this was actually mentioned in the previous panel. And the reason why this fund is especially important for IPLCs is because we come from countries that face the impacts of climate change, and we're the ones who are the most vulnerable to this impact. And this fund will greatly benefit these communities. And we also need to establish dialogue with IPLCs to facilitate constructive challenge, accountability, and joint solutions. So these solutions need not only to be for other parties, but it should be a joint solution. Like, we need to be part of making the solutions, and we need to be on the table. Something else is to ensuring the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities as being vital in the role as guardians of the forest, and not only guardians of the forest, but guardians of the planet, and being part of the agenda at both COP26, COP28, and COP16. COP16 on the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. So both frameworks are actually very important. The UNFCCC and also the UNCPD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And something else is it's also important to strengthen the rights and the role, as I had mentioned, because we have a climate risk mitigation strategy, and we also have the just solution for addressing climate change, because we're the ones who are at the heart of protecting our planet, and we also have the solutions to protecting the world's biodiversity and shaping the global environmental facility. Something very important to remember as IPLCs is that what we also need is the support for traditional knowledge and practices, because as indigenous people, we expect that our traditional knowledge will be respected and integrated in the development of these solutions. So as we're developing these solutions, we need to also integrate traditional knowledge and improve the access to resources, which is the 1.7 billion pledge that was pledged in COP26. So we need to improve that. We need to improve this access to resources and ensure that the funds is trickling down to indigenous communities, and we also expect COP28 to address the root causes of climate change, which include the exploitation of lands and territories, and also the extractive industries. And this is where the fossil fuel companies come in. Especially because we will be in Abu Dhabi, a country where there's a lot of mining and there's a lot of extractive industries. So we are hoping that we will address the root causes of climate change. And above all, we also need to recognize the important role of Indigenous people in preserving the world's biodiversity and the need in having their voices there. And I'm happy to be part of this panel and raising my voice in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for really sharing the key calls and dreams. And what would be some of the entry points for human rights at COP28?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for inviting our teacher to these discussions. And I would really like to thank the panelists who have spoken already for this very interesting discussions we've had so far. I think that I'll be reinforcing some of the points already made. You won't be shocked by that, the essence of the human rights-based approach and how we see the COP, just to set the stage. Why is OCHA engaged on this? Because climate change is an immense threat to the enjoyment of human rights for everyone, everywhere. No doubt. It's already been said, but climate change disproportionately impacts people that are most vulnerable situations already and have done very little for this to come about. And that's really the core of our mandate as well as an office. Our office has engaged with the climate negotiations for almost a decade, and I'm really happy to say that we're doing so, working in such important and meaningful coalitions with civil society organizations, with environmental defenders, with Indigenous peoples, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really key to when you talk about, what are the entry points? How can we go about pushing the conferences of the parties of the UNFCCC to be more impactful and to be more ambitious, reminding ourselves that the ultimate goal of the framework is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. How do we go about that? And how do we go about that in a setting where we see, as already mentioned, an increased number of fossil fuel lobbyists, gas and oil representatives participating at the conference. We see corporate sponsorship of a conference that may not be aligned with the ultimate goal of what we're talking about and trying to achieve at the conference. And I think that this is really where our role as partners, working hand in hand, to push for accountability, push for transparency, and push for inclusivity is key. It was mentioned already. What do we do if the loss and damage fund isn't set up this year properly? What do we do if they're not going to meet? What do we do? How can we impact these processes? And I think the point has already been made very clear. We need to keep up the pressure. And that's what we do all together. Our office works to influence member states. We work jointly with civil society, we work with national human rights institutions. We work in all sorts of coalitions with all sorts of partners to make sure that voices are heard. And participation is really key to all of this. Just to make the link between COP27 and COP28, I think that COP27 was a good example in many ways, illustrating some of the faults of the UNFCCC processes and how that interlinks with reality when COP takes place in a country where civil society is not free to operate and to have their voices heard as they would. And I think that we're taking a lot of lessons away from that into the next COP. The barriers have already been mentioned, related to visas, related to the cost of participation, related to being able to access the negotiations. There were some good examples from ACE, but we saw many other examples where very simple logistical issues, such as meeting rooms capacity, would constrain observers from being able to participate, while on state parties delegations, you would have delegates that were, for example, from the fossil fuel industry and would be able to influence those processes more than civil society voices. So I think that these are lessons that, as an office and as the UN, we're taking with us further and really encourage all of you to continue keeping up the pressure. There are lots of state parties that are very interested in human rights and pushing them to a certain extent, but we also see these global power imbalances and interests and negotiations is exactly where these meet. You have one interest weighing up against another, and to achieve an outcome, some goes and some wins. But I think that's really keeping up the temperature, keeping up attention. Journalists help us. I think The Guardian, just as an example, reporting constantly from what's happening at the negotiation is helpful, but they can't do that unless they have the information from us. So really keep access to information. This is where we all can help disseminate information about what's happening at the COP. I can say for sure, COP27 was the first COP I personally participated in. And just to voice the message that was voiced by a youth representative earlier, landing at the COP, if you don't have a clear and concise role, if you're just on a member state delegation as a token, is not necessarily very meaningful. So to be able to educate ourselves and others about what you can achieve at the COP and how you should engage at the COP, because you're landing at a venue that is almost like a fair, and you have the state parties negotiations, which may almost seem inaccessible, hard to find. The room is full. You need to find an overflow room. You need to see if you can access the internet and be able to follow it online. And to know what to do there. We heard youth representatives at COP27 come to us and say, I'm on a state delegation, but I don't know what to do here. And that's really challenging. And that's really heartfelt from my side. I hear that. And I think that there's a lot of work that we can continue doing together to make sure that those who go to the COP are equipped. And we've seen a lot of talk about youth participation. We know already that for COP28, that's a priority. But I think that we should keep up pushing together to make sure that there's adequate participation from all ranges of society and from different groups, and not just youth, even if that's extremely important. So really, the human rights-based approach, this is what it's all about. It's about negotiations being accessible. You have a right under international human rights law and under international environmental law to participate in public decision-making. And that's what it's all about. You have the right to access that information, to know what the negotiations are about, because these are the negotiations that are determining our future. If we're not limiting greenhouse gas emissions, then there it goes. We're continuing down the trajectory that we're already on. I think that in terms of entry points, one of the things that we wanted to highlight for COP28 is the global stocktake, just because that really is a place where all concerned stakeholders can participate and should participate. There's multiple avenues for doing so. And again, inclusiveness and transparency in that process is really, really key. The stocktake will tell us where we're heading and what we need to do more to reach the goals that we've set out in the Paris Agreement. And then I want to address just very briefly again conflicts of interest, and this is something that we're increasingly looking at our side as well. What do we do? How do we balance that? How do we balance the presence? What's there in the framework already? What's at the discretion of member states, and what can we influence as observers in terms of lobbyists? How can this be declared? Should there be a limit? Should there be proportionate representation? There could be some good lessons learned from WHO, for example, in the tobacco industry, and we see that these examples are increasingly made now that the COP is taking place in the UAE. And then just a final point that I wanted to highlight that was already mentioned about negotiations and discussions related to climate solutions and geoengineering and other sort of very technical matters of dealing with the issue. And just to make sure that I think we have the argumentation at hand to stay away from false climate solutions. And it's up to us again to push for the fact that reducing emissions in the first place is the first and most important thing that can be done. Then we're talking about adaptation and adequate financing for loss and damage. And that really means sufficient funding, and it means funding that goes to the people who are the most impacted, first and foremost. But just to stay on track, I think that's part of our role in this in these negotiations, in this global game, to keep the rights holders at the core of this, and to keep those who hold first and foremost obligations to make sure that they meet them. I think I'll stop here because we're so short of time, but I'll look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Margarita. And I'm sure that you know that we, as faith-based actors, are key partners in really pushing for a human rights approach when it comes to COP28. And we will continue actually this discussion with Eve. Eve, what are the key elements regarding civil society participation in human rights as we look towards COP28?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to this discussion, which has been really very rich. And I want to thank all the previous interventions, even in the previous debates, because it's really. I don't know how much I can add to this, but I just wanted to give perhaps three points of discussion. As Cindy said and underlined, we're going to meet in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. And of course, they are oil producers. But what is interesting to meet in such a place is that it definitely puts the question of transition on the table. So I know there will be probably calls for boycotts and a lot of critiques. I don't think that going to Dubai as such is problematic. Actually, it should rather be, we went to Poland, we went to other places where you also have very strong transition issues. And so I think it's interesting. It's also the place where Masdar is being developed with all of the controversies around it, but it still shows that there is some challenges there to see. It is also, but perhaps, it is also very strongly, they are trying to position themselves on the world scene as a trade place, which is an interesting thing to look at. Now, probably for us as NGOs going over there, this is one of the first points where I have to be very careful. We saw very well in Sharm el-Sheikh that you had basically really a huge climate trade fair. And you were able to access the negotiation only going through the trade fairs. There was no possibilities to avoid. You had to go to it. Knowing the capacity and the know-how in that region about trade fairs and trade business in general, it's also going to be a huge issue there. You're going to have I'm expecting to have a very, very big one. And so we have to question ourselves, how much do we participate to the smoke screen, or how much do we participate to the real discussion? And this is not a theoretical question. We can see already that a lot of money is flowing, is coming, is being announced, it has been promised. And I think we have, within the civil society, to raise a few questions. Corruption is not only an issue within governments, it can also be within the civil society. So we do need transparency. We do need clear ethical guidelines to know exactly where we're going to be standing. And that can be very physical, where we will be standing in Dubai. And now, of course, going also in the Emirates, we can't, keep silent about the fact that it's a country directly involved in a terrible war in Yemen, with one of the worst humanitarian crises, unfortunately, not looked at enough. That they are directly involved in land grabbing. You have a number of indigenous people in Africa that have been directly deprived of their own land, who have been removed from their lands due to their clearly direct policy of that country. And of course, we cannot keep silent about the nomination of the presidency, especially that you did have other personalities in Dubai. They have a number of leading figures, like in the field of environment. They have also important women who are well known on the international scene. They decided that it would be the president of the oil company that would be chairing this. And this is a clear message. And I think we have to hear it, just like we're hearing all of the messages about the great success of all of the oil companies these days. We're heading to a meeting where we're going to have a very clear message to tell us who is the boss. And that's the big oil industry. That's going to be the fossil fuel majors. They're the ones who are running the shows, actually within our own countries in the north also. And we saw that in some of the debates we've had here. So here we're heading to a discussion where we're going to have to talk about directly the power issues. And one of the problems we had, at least I see, in the development of the UNFCCC recently, is that basically we've been able to do some progress, except for what you described very well about the loss and damage at the last meeting, which was definitely a progress. But basically, we're able to progress when we are not challenging the power structure, be it nationally or internationally. There, of course, if you're able to find a way, and there are ways, we can adapt, we can negotiate a few things, as long as it's not structurally changing the power structure, we're ready to go forward. And we see that, unfortunately, because it's not just a theoretical issue. We see that when we work in the field of human rights, when we try to protect environmental and climate defenders. Now, all human rights organizations, very classical ones, just working on civil and political rights, are all recognizing now since a number of years that what's happening in the field of land defenders and environmental defenders is the one which is constantly worsening, where the violence is getting more severe, where we have the most protection issues. Everywhere, on all of the continents, all of them, with different trends, different signs, and so on, which means that it is clearly a huge issue. And when we look at these issues, we see that human rights is at the center of a number of energy discussions, energy issues. So there, and you said very clearly, how in the discussion, mitigation has been considered as being basically the capitalistic and the technical solution. And of course, that has to be challenged. But it is also clearly a power issue. And we cannot, us as civil society, we must not let this issue being precisely described or defined as just being a technical or a money issues. It is a power issues. And we need more ambition on mitigation, because we see today decisions which are being made, especially in the South, under the influence of big oil, which are trapping the countries for 30 years or even more investment that are creating more pollutions, not only just at the level of the climate change, but also at the local level, and which are preventing other, very often more community-oriented energy solutions, exactly the way you were describing it. So we are seeing this everywhere, and we see that it is not today put in the middle of the mitigation discussion, and this is really a challenge. And going to Dubai means we're going to have to challenge it. So when we're going there, finally, just 3 points. I totally agree on the question of the conflicts of interest. It's a major issue, but it's just not an issue just for the UNFCCC. It's an issue for the whole of the UN system. It's an issue for the whole of the international community. We have to take now this unfortunate example, not just to blame the Emirates. That won't lead us to any place. And anyway, they've been supported by the US, by EU, and so on. So it's a collective issue. It's not just an Emirate issue. We have to say now, we cannot continue to have this constant confusion between private and public interest, with a clear ideology behind saying, oh, private interest, big private interest, because they're so big. Of course, it means they are public interest, too big to fail. So private interests now are being defined as public. This is the way just to destruction and some kind of huge collective suicide at the level of the planet. So we have to stop this, and we have to put this question very clearly on the table in Dubai. We have also to bring a very clear impact. As you were saying, this is one of the challenges. What is really the impact of climate change already today on so many people? The film we started this discussion with is a very clear one of, unfortunately, so many other elements. And as we are entering now in the UNFCCC, in the implementation phases, which was one of the big highlights in Sharm el-Sheikh, and you were rightly talking about the global stocktake, for example, is a very good example of that. We have to be stronger in getting the message through the question about the impact. And finally, we need clear ambitions on all 3 pillars. Now we're in a new situation in Sharm el-Sheikh, and since the win on the loss and damage, to have clearly in the UNFCCC 3 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. All 3 must be always taken together in a coherent manner, and we must stop this kind of fragmentation, which is unfortunately a power play. And I really conclude by supporting what Alex has said. In the preparation process, the preparation does not only start once we're going to go or taking the plane to Dubai. It starts today. And for example, what we can do in the field with the human rights bodies is extremely important. We need to do more of that, because this is part of the preparation process to Dubai. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, E, for that really clear-eyed appraisal of the power dynamics, and therefore also the huge challenges ahead. We now move to Budi. Budi, what are the key messages from the Interfaith Talanoa dialogue? So this is an event, a space where faith-based organizations gather to really discuss key issues at the COP. It's a space where we organize, but also derive strength from each other. We held this Interfaith Talanoa dialogue as well at COP27. We've been holding it for several years now. But what are some of the key messages coming out of that Interfaith Talanoa dialogue that we need to take forward to COP28?
So thank you very much, Athena, and thank you very much for the previous panelists who with very, very impressive analysis on the situations now, and as well as the challenges that we are facing for COP28. But allow me a little bit to go back to the film, because while there were negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, I went to Solomon Island to see the reality in Solomon Island. As many of us say that we, the faith-based communities, are at the forefront. No, we are the one who are being with them, part of the victims, part of those who are impacted, but also part of those who are questioned by the communities. I was really, I had a nightmare between the bracket when the community asked us, so you come here, collect our information, filming, get all these things. What does it mean for us then afterward? No? You need to go back again to us and bring response, because for us, it's a real thing. They lost the, at least in Solomon Island, they lost 5 islands. It's increasing. And to make the situation worse, now Solomon Island, if you read in the newspaper, it becomes a battleground between certain superpower and the community. We were there to do a little bit of workshop on the impact of logging, as well as the EPR, because we are trying to be coherent. We are faith-based organizations, many of us, but we are also human rights organizations. So we need to see how to combine or how to use the human rights approach in addressing some of the key challenges, including climate change. And at the same time, as we are with them, so we need to be able to use those big languages, let's put it in that way, to something that is understandable for the community. Those communities, they don't use the word loss and damage. No, they don't use the word human rights. No, they don't use those languages, but they use the language. Yes, we are now affected. And look at the children. They're still happy because they don't really understand what's going on, but they face the reality becoming more and more difficult. And they have to change their way of life. They have to adapt to the new reality. And I think one of the panelists was also talking about the responsibility of the local political scene. This is also a huge challenge for them, because the thing is that because Solomon Island is really at my heart now, because of the new reality now with the government that has swept a certain political alliance, etc., they are really faced with, in one hand, the slow onset impact of climate change. On the other hand, also the new reality in which might accelerate that, because the numbers of logging companies have increased. Now they said it's getting hotter now. It's difficult to get fish. Now we have to do this. So it's very concrete realities. And then when we are there, we have to respond to these questions in an understandable way. So it is challenging for us. And how do we bring this reality to COP28? So there's a big challenge, no? And as some of us rightly note, that more than 80% of the populations, to some extent, are related to faith. So sometimes when they can't really question to their authorities, because authorities somewhere out there, the Ministry of Climate Change is really high above, but pastor, imam, priest, it's with them day to day. Nuns, it's with them day to day. And they're supposed to be able to some extent, providing enlightened questions. And of course, it's not very easy. So based on that reality, what we are trying to do is always to be part of these global discussions. It's very important for us to represent the communities, but at the same time, providing input back to them, because they are the people that we are representing, and we need to be accountable to them. So based on that reality, as you know, that the faith-based organizations, in particular the Interfaith License Committee, with Geneva Interfaith Forum on Climate Change, Human Rights and Environment, we are trying to play a little bit of role there. We don't say that we are the hero, but we are trying to play a little bit of role. So therefore, since the COP in Bonn, if I'm not mistaken, we started to have this space in which we can have people coming, discussing, sharing of what do we want or what do we see as the process. In COP27, for once more, we organized the Interfaith Talanoa Dialogue, in which we have some calls, and it is accessible to the ILC website. But I would like to highlight on some of the key issues, which I think it's quite relevant for our discussions, either as negotiator, as faith-based communities, as human rights NGOs, as people at the UN, so that we can really have this call as part of our struggle, part of our work. No? I will not read the whole thing because it will take time, but one of the key issues is, as Eve mentioned, regarding the human rights defenders working on the environmental issues. And this should not be identified only for those who work on the NGOs. No, I have to remember people from Paro in Guadalcanal in Solomon Island, because they are the one at the forefront. They are the one who are challenging logging companies. So they are human rights defenders, although they don't identify themselves as human rights defenders. And how to protect this kind of people who can challenge the authorities' decisions in which bring themselves in danger, but also the fact that they are the one who in fact try to defend their environment from the impact of climate change, from the exploitations. So I think that is one of the call that we focus. And then on the issue of loss and damage, in which we are very much interested on your explanation, Vice. I think the question from Pakistan was also part of our questions. No, okay, you have these discussions, but what about the reality? The reality in Pakistan. It's not in Pakistan. The reality in Solomon Island. The reality may be also in Switzerland and Valais. In many places, no? How, if we have this loss and damage fund, can be accessible for those who are impacted directly. So I think that's also part of our call, that this should be transparency, accessibility, and also how the real affected communities can be involved in the implementations of the use of loss and damage. And I think the call of the youth and indigenous people is same. How to put them at the center of the discussion, not at the periphery, because in some extent they are in the periphery, no? But they should be in the center of the discussion. I think it's very important that they might have different views than this very technical views, but they are the one who are impacted directly. Other goals will also include the role of women and girls, because they are also impacted in a different ways. So the voice of women and girls should also be at the center, as well as the just transition, how to include this just transition as really part of the discussions, and how to prioritize that just transitions in the mitigation discussion. And finally, I think we also try to challenge ourselves as the faith communities, because as the faith communities, we need also to prove that we can do something as well, because being present in different parts of the world, I think the change of lifestyle and putting pressure to our authorities, putting pressure in a very structured and a wide global way will or might bring the real change. And I'm, once again, I would like to emphasize when Vice said that maybe loss and damage will not be immediate, fund will not be immediately, except that if there is big pressure, no, and that might be the role for us as the faith-based communities, together with others, to put that pressures, the civil society pressures, the people's pressure, might accelerate this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Budi, for that. I would also just like to remind, especially our friends online, again, please put forward your questions in the chat box. Also, because two of our speakers will be having to leave like exactly 12:30 on the dot. So I'm saying this before we move on to our last input. So we have again, Vice, and given again your role in the negotiations, and particularly from a Global South perspective, we would like to hear from you again. What are the key points for COP28?
Thank you. No, thank you for that. And I've been listening, with much interest, what Cindy and Elena and Liz and Woody have said. I do have some slides, if you could put them up. It just follows from where we ended. Because I think it would be a good structure the conversation, but if not, it's okay. So what do we need to watch out for at COP27? So I would say, Elena mentioned it, the global stocktake. That's important. That's an important entry point for civil society. So just go to the next slide. Largely because we will have key findings by the middle of this year, negotiations over the decision over the course of the year, and then a leader's declaration. And I will be engaged in that as well, because I will be coordinating the G77 in that particular topic as well. Then, of course, we have the Loss and Damage Fund. We are going to be talking about climate finance, and we'll be talking about adaptation. Next slide. So what do all of these things have in common, at least from developing countries and maybe from us as advocates? I think equity is the key issue that we need to keep on raising, because it's about justice, it's about equity, and making sure that it's reflected in terms of how we would approach climate change vis-a-vis the human rights that we want to achieve. And in the negotiating context, what we're trying to do is really create some kind of equity-oriented international cooperation mechanism. So the next slide. And I think the concept that we have to focus on is equity as fairness, which is quite different from equality. It goes back several thousand years back to Aristotle. Equals should be treated unequally and unequals unequally. And when you apply it to the negotiations, it's really about not treating developing countries the same way as developed countries have in terms of obligations. Next slide. And I think this encapsulates it, because the way that one looks, what I have observed in the negotiations, the way that developed countries tend to look at the climate negotiations is to say that they would still have equal rights to the remaining carbon budget, even if they've actually used up most of the rest. So equality does not mean fairness in this case. Next slide. And I think we have to really reflect on, what the calls are when we want to push it as advocates. And that's why the reason I keep saying equity is the key, because we have to make sure that when we understand that the reality that we live in creates a lot of inequality, pushing for equality actually breeds more inequality. And that's why we have to push for equity, because in the end of it all, equity, having an equity-based orientation when we talk about climate cooperation, next slide, is about climate justice, where we try to provide some assistance to those that are less capable of doing so, but eventually with the idea that we will end up with some kind of leveling off of everybody in terms of the way that we approach. And so next slide, I guess, shows us sort of like the kind of framework that we would like to have, which is that you would have all countries doing, as Eve was saying, doing mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage together, but with still some kind of recognition that there are differences in endowments among countries and communities that necessitate some kind of assistance and support going to those that are there. Eve talked, and the next slide, please. And I think that will be my last slide before I go to the, I will not go to the rest. Eve talked about power issues. And one of the things that perhaps we have to understand in the context of the climate negotiations is that more and more it is becoming a reflection of broader geopolitical dynamics. The fight over equity and CBDR is, as far as developed countries are concerned, about making sure that China and India and Brazil and South Africa gets treated, and the Philippines and Pakistan gets treated like developed countries when it comes to obligations. And the only countries that are going to be given a free pass in terms of climate action will be LDCs and small island states. But not recognizing that if you look at the overall picture, there are more people who remain in poverty in many of these middle income developing countries than there are in all the LDC since it's combined. So there's also the whole issue about, expanding the contributor base and all of these things. So I'm gonna put it up there and sort of like segue to the two concluding statements I would like to highlight. When we talk about power issues, I would say that in the climate negotiations, we're actually talking about 5 interlinked power issues, and try to sort of like put them in very like either or. One is that there's a power issue over looking at climate action as a public good or as a private wealth generation mechanism. And that's one key aspect of it, which we have to clearly understand, because there's one narrative that drives in one way. Many of us campaigning organizations want it to be public good, but there's a very strong narrative that talks about private wealth. Second, there's a very strong power struggle in the context of the climate negotiations over what has priority. Is it community welfare or is it technological solutions? Right? And again, it plays in many parts of the climate regime. There is a power issue in terms of the discussions over should we talk about social justice or should we talk about profits? And again, we don't hear that a lot because no one really says it about in that way. But again, as some of you were saying, the presence of fossil fuel lobbyists, I think, indicates where one side would be going. There is a power issue over whether the climate regime and climate actions are about cooperation or about competition. And this goes back to this whole issue of public goods and private wealth. And finally, I would argue that there is also a very deep underlying issue over whether climate action is about decolonization or is it about continued hegemony. And I think that's why I'm ending with this slide, because I think more and more that kind of dynamic will become much more clear in the climate negotiations. So let me end with some possible advocacy entry points, because many of you have sort of like raised it. And I will highlight 4. One is that because this is a faith-based community, one is national level advocacy and work is extremely important. And I think we have all recognized that. Not only in terms of the activism and the organizing that we need to do, but also in terms of engaging governments at the national level and at the subnational level. Because whether we like it or not, when we talk about the international climate regime, it's still being seen as very much as a state-driven, state-centric international law framework. So national level work. Second, we have to link that to very strong international campaigns. And that is where, formations like WCC is going to be important. And that means that we have to talk about creating greater understanding. And that means, for example, as Elena was saying, if you bring youth into your delegations or if you bring youth into the COP27, you really have to tell them and help our colleagues understand, where they can enter and do that. Second is we have to have a very strong research and media part of our campaigning. Because if the fight is over public goods or social wealth and profits or decolonization and hegemony, we need to be able to also make sure that we are clear about what our own narratives are. And that narrative can only be shaped if we are clear about our research and we are clear about how we shape the media language that we want to put in. Third is about dialogue and engagement. And that means we have to clearly understand what are the political spaces that we want to engage in, subnational, national, international, and in the context of the climate negotiations, how you want to approach the climate negotiators. Because I can tell you from experience, once we enter the negotiations, we go into our black hole. And none of you that go through the, as you were saying, the trade fair, right, will see us. I mean, in Sharm el-Sheikh, I didn't even go, well, I passed through them, but I didn't even go into any of the pavilions because we got sucked into this dynamic. And usually, if the 25,000 people who attend all of these COPs, most likely is not more than 500 people actually do the negotiations on the text. So understanding the political space is important because if we want to be able to influence, we have to get to those 500 people, and we have to get to the people who give the instructions to those 500 people back home in capital. So political space, understanding the process, knowing who to reach, and understanding the underlying interests that make government representatives say the things that they say is very important. And then finally, and this is where I think it's extremely important what Elena and Eve and Budi were saying, we have to do interlinkage work. Because if it's broader geopolitical dynamics and it's broader power issues that are at play here, we cannot keep our advocacy only in the context of the climate negotiations if that's what we want. We have to understand why is, for example, geoengineering being discussed in the Human Rights Council and in the UNGA as a climate solution. And what is that link of that conversation to the fossil fuel industry and what they're doing in the climate negotiations? And why is the discussion in the WTO so important when they talk about trade liberalization in environmental goods? And why is that linked to the work in WIPO with respect to the patenting of environmental goods? The questions are, who owns the technology, who controls the technology, who profits from those technology? So maybe let me end there. Sorry for all of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice. And those power issues, deeply ethical, deeply moral questions. I want to thank all our speakers. Thank you, Cindy, Therese, Eve, Budi, and Vice again for your very, very critical inputs, which will help us as we strategize, not just as a faith community, but as a broader civil society community towards COP28. We don't have a lot of time. I wanted to quickly check in if there was a burning question, perhaps online. And I don't know if yeah, I'm just checking in with you. Hopefully some people, some of our speakers can still weigh in.
So online, we did have quite a few questions. So I'll just quickly check some 2 or 3. So it's quicker. So Margarita Voltai asked if you see that there is a need for a recognized interfaith constituency at the COP. Since there are the suggestions for religious pavilions and specific participations of religious leaders and youth. Another question related to whether the UNFCCC is an actual adequate framework to address the climate change, and whether there is a case to bring forward alternative approaches through law outside the UNFCCC that can redress some of the structural imbalances. And the rest of the questions were mostly related to how to manage the imbalance of powers, how to work with it in practice during the negotiations. Yeah, there are some other questions, but
thank you so much. Is there a burning question in the room? Perhaps you can take 1 or 2, and then hopefully Vice can stay for a few more minutes. And please go ahead, and then please introduce yourselves also.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah,
keep the questions short.
Yeah, Riyad Bazia, civil society activist in the US for 20 years ago. I will be concise. That's about. Thank you very much. I appreciate all what I hear, but I wanted to add to about what I hear, because on this COP28, we should think also about CBD. Yes, nowadays we hear many official representative government talking about CBDs, but we understand that the negotiation on CBDs, yes, state members didn't succeed to adopt another additional protocol to Kyoto, but they adopt actually a target artificially Japanese, and did it be successful 2020
30 by 30.
Until, yes, 10 years. But what does it mean? It means it was adopted as a success, but success didn't be so. But nowadays we have another step, and there is genetic links, of course, between biodiversity and climate change. But what I hear, yes, Glasgow said, and the last COP, we see how many CEOs they attend the private sectors. They attend the university, many, it was a record. But we understand something as a civil society, because there is plenary with the government, but the plenary between each other private sector. But anyway, civil society, it's complement for government. But we understand and analyze, it's one word, it is mainly on financial problematic. It means the private sector will negotiate what they are doing between. But let me finish. The private sector, government, and the trade unions, what it usually happened in ILO. But anyway, trade unions or civil society, but what you call social dialogue in ILO. We understand that it is mainly on finance and the future fund. But before being adopted by state members, civil society we can make our analysis and contribute, not until it have been adopted. And we know how many private sector, they are more powerful for the government. But I will be ended about something, because I hear Mr. Ibrahim talk about and what it will be happen in Dubai city, which is nearest to Doha, to Abu Dhabi anyway, and Doha. And we remember in COP28, it was in Doha, and we did many things. But we can understand civil society. It's also
thank you so much. Sorry to really
friendship between each other and between local civil society. And we were not waiting the government to support civil society members. If we have friendship there and here, we are welcomed, and welcomeness, it is mainly by the state who is organizer. And the state organizer, they are ready to help also civil society.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm sorry for I'm trying to keep the time a bit. We have two more questions. We have Masiwa and Manuj. You also keep the questions super short so that we actually have time for a response. Masiwa first.
Thank you. My first big question, I'm Masiwa with the World Council of Churches. The first is related to the loss and damage fund. Is this another kind of white savior saving black communities kind of fund, which is sit within the colonial framework? And secondly, how seriously are we taking green colonization in our activism on climate justice?
It's a comment and a follow-up. I see it's a very broad discussion. We had 3 blocks. One is about public advocacy, where we need to increase the pressure. The second is about the deep interconnections, which you mentioned, very complex and deep interconnections, which we need to analyze. The third is what is actually happening and where do you want to influence? I would really appeal that, that you systematically help us with some opinion pieces, some clear messages from this. Because a lot of stuff has come, and very simple or at least comprehensive pieces you can write and please share it widely. Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I think there are questions around the UNFCCC mechanism, whether this is adequate. There's questions around the loss and damage fund, and these are questions that I think might, wondering whether Vice and also Eve can reflect on. There is a question that was related to this broad interfaith constituency at the COP, to what extent it is working effectively on these issues, which I will direct to Budi. Also a question on the CBD. And I think perhaps, Cindy, if you're still there, because you brought up the importance of the Convention on Biodiversity as well in your presentation. So, and then of course we have Manish's question, which everyone can reflect on. So I will start with you, Vice, because I know you have to run.
Thank you. I'll take the balance of power and a couple of other questions. One, the imbalance of power issue is something that I think, we have to, I think, be very clear about. As campaigning organizations, as advocacy organizations or advocates, I guess, there's a lopsided balance of power vis-a-vis governments. And even among governments, there's also that deep imbalance. And I guess for those of us who are both inside and outside, trying to see what would be just and fair and equitable in the climate negotiations context, we do rely a lot on campaigning organizations to do two things. One is to network, and second is to advocate within their own governments. And the reason I'm saying that is because developed country governments tend to listen much more to their own NGOs than to those of the NGOs from the global south, no matter how much they say. And this actually goes back to your question. And the loss and damage discussions was a case in point. I think a big part of the movement came when we had a lot of our friends, for example, doing advocacy in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, pushing there. So while we might have had the public media and all that very high profile, I think it was the fact that you had a lot of the, and this is going back to the understanding about political space, a lot of the, say, organizations, the trade unions, for example, that the Biden administration was looking for support from, sort of like saying, you gotta okay the loss and damage fund. Same thing in Brussels. So networking and organizing and national level advocacy are, I think, the key things that we have to rely on to change that balance of power. Then last comment on the green colonialism and whether it's white savior saving Black communities fund. Honestly, when we first started talking about the loss and damage fund back in Madrid among developing country negotiators, we were not very sure whether we wanted to suggest another fund that would not be funded or whether it would be an empty shell or something. But in the end, we decided that this is another way to keep on pressing that justice and equity message. Because this was part of trying to create a multilateral climate regime that has all of the elements, institutional elements that are necessary there for it to actually work if the political will is there. And so you, like I was explaining earlier, you've got this slow development of the regime. And this was also an assertion of historical responsibility, because we were saying, you need this fund because you guys who colonized us for 350 years, destroyed our peoples, massacred us, and when we became free from political colonialism, we still remain under colonialism economically, you have got to pay for it. So it's not white savior, it's asserting that they were responsible and they have at some point in time have to accept that responsibility. So for us, that was the symbolism, I guess, in a way, of having that kind of loss and damage fund. But in addition to that, colonialism still comes into play a lot in many of the climate negotiations. And I've been reading this. For example, there's this idea, different things. One is they call it ecological imperialism or computational colonialism. And you Google it. What it essentially says is that when we talk about the science of climate change and how science of climate change relates to policy of climate change and reflected in climate negotiations. A big part of it is that much of the science is still generated in the global north. And that creates a systemic problem as well, because that science comes with it implicit assumptions about who deserves a better life. Right? And I have experienced this myself. For example, when I was a negotiator for the Philippines back in 2014 for the IPCC, I was handling this issue on sustainable transport. And in the IPCC report that came out back in 2014, they said the authors, who were, I think about 80% of the authors for the chapter were about from the global north, they said, okay, sustainable transport means let's move quickly, right? Away from fossil fuel to clean transportation. And they said the best way, the most efficient way is if you're a country that has a good road network with a high level of, good, public transportation infrastructure, the quickest way to do that is to shift people away from internal combustion engine vehicles into electrics, right? Driving around, because it's easy. But if you're a country that has a big population, the road network is not very good, and the best way to do that is to invest in public transport systems. But if you're a country that has a big population, rapidly growing, road transportation network is almost non-existent, and you have huge amounts of poverty in there, then your prioritization should be on non-mechanized transport. Right? So I raised my hand and I said, excuse me, scientists. So are you saying that countries like Switzerland or the United States, nice road network, or that the best way to do that is people start driving Lexus and, the hybrids? But if you're from the Philippines, we have to satisfy ourselves with riding around in trams and trains and buses. But if you're something like my colleague here from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they have to ride bicycles. Is that what you're saying as an IPCC chapter? And so you should have seen the scientists starting, no, that's not what we're saying. So anyway, I said, and the reason why I'm saying that story is because when we talk about the science of climate change and how it applies to policy, there's a lot of implicit assumptions in there, right? And that's what we have to be very careful about. And this is coming out over and over again. For example, in the latest AR6 reports, many of the models for mitigation in there assume, for example, that by the year 2050, GDP in the global north will be at least still 4 times more than the average in the global south. Why? Right? There are implicit assumptions in there about fossil fuel use, for example, with the global north continuing to use 2 or 3 times more still than in the global south. So there are many of those implicit assumptions that do not make it into the public domain because they're hidden within the models. Right? And so that's one of those things that I was talking about when you talk about colonialism, that colonialism comes up in different ways. It's overt, can be, hidden, and all those kinds of things. Sorry, I just got so wrapped up about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice. Thank you very much. Do you want to start?
Very briefly about the interfaith pavilion. I think we need to look at that opportunity in a very, very critical and careful way. I think no decision has been made yet from our perspective because we don't want to be a tokenism. Because the tokenism can also be dangerous, like religion washing or whatever, faith washing that will be done in COP28. But I think ILC, the Interfaith License Committee, has been discussing that issue and how, if it happens, how to react to that, whether to use it or to use it in one way or the other way to be a bit more critical. But surely faith communities should not be co-opted for the interest of the big power. Let's put it in that way. Regarding the role of the interfaith constituency, I think whatever position that we can obtain in the COP negotiations, we are always there. But it's as a constituency in itself or through different ways, we are always there. We will do our best and trying really to push the voice, the observations coming from our community in the negotiation. And I guess what I said, like there are 500 and how to influence those 500. It's a big challenge that perhaps the faith communities can try to identify on strategic way to how to say to influence the 500 people who are working on the text.
Thank you so much. Cindy, are you still online? And if you are, I was wondering if you wanted to say a bit more about how we connect the discussions at the UNFCCC with the UN Convention on Biodiversity discussions, but I'm not sure if Cindy is still there. No? Okay. So Ivo, take it as well as take the other.
I'll try to be very brief. Just say it's pity Cindy can't be with us, but just one point on what you were saying about the green colonialism. At least one of the positive elements of the outcome of the what happened in Montreal with the COP15 and the adoption of the global biodiversity framework, which has a lot of bias and weaknesses and so on. But what was clear, at least, was a recognition that could have been stronger, but is there, about the rights of indigenous people, and that the fact you cannot do conservation without consulting the people and so on. So in a way, it's not enough. It's not the full answer to what you're saying about green colonialism, but it is a start. And at least I had the pleasure to have it was the Human Rights Day over there. And I had the pleasure to spend the whole day actually at the Nature Positive Pavilion that was run by World Wildlife Fund, IUCN, and all of these. The discussions there were extremely clear about, I remember one of the witnesses saying, I don't see the difference between green conservation and mining industry. Both of them has exactly the same impact on my people, with very clear proposals and so on. So what I appreciated over there was a very clear, open dialogue, which was not hiding the fact or trying to cheat with the reality. Is the outcome good enough? No. But at least things were clearly said, and I think this is the first step going in a good direction. It's only the beginning of the story. So there are some possibilities. And again, when we have the discussion about climate and environmental defenders, it's exactly the same issue. So thank you for raising it, because I think it's a very important one. And I think also another way to go to challenge this goes in the same line as what Vice said before. I think the question of the three pillars, mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, should not only be considered as just an element of the UNFCCC. It should be our own framework, our own references, also at the national level. So within our own countries, and Vice was very correct in saying how important this is, we have again to raise always the three questions. And none of the three can be avoided or should be left on the side. And that can also start to change the discussion. But also, how in my own country, and of course, as you can see, I'm from the north, how do you deal with the three in the policy itself, and not just, we're going to give some money to the loss and damage fund. No, that's not enough. How do we integrate the historical elements in the way we are developing our own climate policy? And today we're not at all. So the thing of having this recognized at UNFCCC gives us a much stronger capacity to say, now, listen, these are the three pillars of our actions. That's how we should move forward. And to finish, and being here in the interfaith dialogue, I just want to add something on what Vice had said, which was so true about the question of science. Let's not forget the IPCC. We have to be very careful not to undermine the work of the IPCC itself, because the idea of the IPCC is to reflect what science is producing. So we cannot blame the IPCC if it reflects what science is producing, because that's its mandate, which means the debate has to be one step further before, which is how do we organize science in itself, and how do we do it? And that's very important, because I see very well how we can undermine some of the outcomes of the IPCC and the oil industry just waiting for that. So they'll just jump on it. So we have to be careful with who we're going to dance, not all partners are recommendable. But what is really, I think, interesting is if we see, not all science are exactly structured the same way. and we do have an issue with economic sciences. I think today there's more science in theological faculties than in economic faculties. I think theological debate has moved from theology faculties to economy. And a lot of what is coming out of economic or a business plan, business bachelors and all of that is much more a new type of theology. So perhaps we should have, the spiritual theologies, faculties and the materialistic theology and call them for what they are. Unfortunately, they are still considered as being science, which is a real problem. And that's exactly what will be reflected in the IPCC work, because they are reflecting the scientific production and they have to read what has been published. So I think we have to be very clear the way we're going to attack this, because we're going to have to do it. I think we're going to see more and more problems between what is coming out of working group 1 on physical science, which is basically always the same. But now it's going to be challenged by precisely much more biased approaches by the other working groups, precisely because they are relying on academic disciplines, which are not all following the same type of scientific approach as the one in working group 1, because it's physical science. So we have to be very careful of that. And I think it's a very important debate, not to undermine the IPCC, but to challenge the way science is very often organized when it's not science, it's pseudoscience, and basically it's theology. And a lot of economists are today, unfortunately, the big priests, and we see in which mess it brings us. So I think it's an important issue.
Thank you so much, Eve, for that. I think one of the key takeaways coming from this session is really how these are issues of power, and therefore, whether it's science, whether it is civil society, faith-based organizations, we must, as science, as FBOs, work together with G77 governments. I think this is the only way that we can begin to shift the power imbalance that was very much lifted out in our discussions today. So I just wanted to say deep thanks on behalf of the Geneva Interfaith Forum on Climate Change, Environment and Human Rights for, I think, what was a really rich and deep discussion with really helpful entry points as we strategize, because this is what we really have to do now. We have to strategize, and we have to strategize together because there is no time. There is no time. And with that, thank you. And as an expression of our thanks, please join us for a bit of food, a bit of, and we can continue discussing as well as we share this food.
Maybe you can also share that the links will be available for people to share, because I think this was precious information.
Absolutely. This event has been recorded. We will be sharing the link to the recording. We will also share the PowerPoint, for instance, that Vice President.
Also online.
Thanks. And thank you to everyone who joined online. I mean, this was how many hours? So that was a major commitment. And thank you for participating and being with us, if not physically in this other online world. We are still connected. And I'm sorry that you cannot join our little meal. Again, deep thanks to everyone.